A single playing card. That's what they found in the mud outside Guettar, Tunisia, on the morning of March 24th, 1943. A jack of spades, face down in the blood-dark soil, 20 meters from a knocked-out German Panzerkampfwagen 4, whose hull was still ticking from the heat. Nobody knew which soldier had dropped it. Nobody ever found out. But the men of the 18th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, understood what it meant to them. Somebody had been holding that card when the world ended. Somebody had been sitting still long enough to carry something as useless as a playing card. And then the ground had swallowed him up. 72 hours before that card ended up in the mud, a German general named Jürgen von Arnim, commander of Army Group Africa, successor to Erwin Rommel, aristocrat, career soldier, and man who believed completely in the incompetence of the American military, sat in his command tent outside Gafsa and made a prediction that he committed to paper. The Americans under Patton, he wrote, would not hold the high ground at Guettar past 3 days. They lacked the discipline. They lacked the experience. They lacked the will. He was so certain that he didn't reinforce the position he was predicting they'd fail to take. That was the mistake that cost him Africa. But here is the question von Arnim never answered, because he spent the rest of the war in a British prisoner of war camp. What exactly happened in those 72 hours that turned a German general's certainty into rubble? March 17th, 1943. Tebessa, Algeria, 31 miles from the Tunisian border. George S. Patton had been in command of 2nd Corps for exactly 7 days when he convened the briefing that changed the campaign. He hadn't been given 2nd Corps because Washington loved him. He'd been given the 2nd Corps because it was broken. 6 weeks earlier, at Kasserine Pass, a name that still made American officers go quiet, the Germans had torn through 2 divisions like paper. Nearly 6,500 American soldiers killed, wounded, or captured in 4 days. The world press had printed the obvious conclusion. American soldiers couldn't fight. German soldiers were professionals. The gap between them was simply too wide to close in one war. Patton walked into that briefing and said, in the flat, clipped voice that men who served under him could still hear in their sleep 30 years later, "We are going to take Guettar, and then we are going to keep going until somebody makes us stop." Nobody in that tent doubted him. What they doubted was whether their legs would carry them that far. The strategic picture was this. By March 1943, Allied forces in North Africa were pressing toward the Tunisian coastline from 2 directions. British General Montgomery's 8th Army pushing north from Libya, and the American 2nd Corps pushing east from Algeria. Between them and the sea stood Army Group Africa, approximately 170,000 Axis soldiers in prepared defensive positions across some of the most brutal terrain in the Mediterranean theater. Guettar was the hinge. Take it, and the road to Gabes opened. Take Gabes, and Montgomery's path linked with Patton's, and the German position in Tunisia became a pocket with no exit. Von Arnim knew this, and what he didn't know was who he was dealing with. Captain Thomas J. Rourke, 28 years old, Scranton, Pennsylvania, commanding officer of B Company, 18th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, had been in North Africa since November 1942. He was not, by any standard measure, a dramatic man. His men described him as the kind of officer who listened before he talked, which in the American Army of 1943 was rarer than it should have been. He had a photograph in his breast pocket of his wife, Catherine, and their son, Patrick, who had just turned 2. He had not seen either of them in 14 months. He read the photograph more than he looked at it. Rourke's B Company was 187 men on paper. Going into Guettar, it was 163. The gaps had been filled by Kasserine, men who had gone forward and not come back, men whose replacements hadn't arrived yet, men who had arrived and hadn't been trained to fill the shoes they'd been handed. The soldiers Rourke knew by name, the ones who would matter in what was coming. Sergeant First Class Dominic Aguilera, 31, El Paso, Texas, his platoon sergeant, built like a railroad tie, who had the specific gift of being loudest when the noise around him was loudest, which meant his men could always hear him. Staff Sergeant Owen Price, 24, Cardiff-born but American by citizenship since 1939, who carried a compass that had belonged to his father in the last war and trusted it more than any map. And Private First Class Leonard Osei, 19, Chicago, Illinois, B Company's best radio operator, the kid who could coax a transmission out of a set that 2 other men had given up on. The plan, as Second Corps designed it, was sequential. The 1st Infantry Division would advance east along the road from Gafsa, securing the valley floor at El Guettar, while flanking units pushed into the Jebel Orbata Hills on the left and the eastern Dorsal Ridge on the right. Rourke's company had the road itself, the most exposed position in the advance, the one that an enemy with properly positioned artillery could close in 40 minutes. There was one flaw in the plan that headquarters didn't know about yet. The intelligence on German artillery positions had come from an Algerian contact who had crossed through the area 11 days earlier. 11 days in a mobile war is an eternity. What the contact had seen and what was still in those positions when Rourke's men started moving were 2 entirely different realities. Nobody told Rourke this. He found out himself. Meanwhile, 40 kilometers to the east, in a German divisional headquarters that smelled of motor oil and cigarettes, General Lieutenant Fritz von Broich, commander of the 10th Panzer Division, the formation that would be waiting for Rourke, was reading the same intelligence reports about American Second Corps that von Arnim had read. He set them down and said to his operations officer, Major Helmut Krebs, "Patton, I've read the file on Patton. He's theatrical. Americans like theatrical, but theatrical commanders make theatrical mistakes. They attack where it looks dramatic, not where it is wise. Give me 3 days." Krebs noted the comment in the war diary. He dated it to March 18th, 1943. 3 days, 72 hours. The clock was already running. This video gives you the story. But the Combat Blueprint, our free newsletter, and gives you everything that doesn't fit in a video. Deeper details. Forgotten heroes, free to join. 10 seconds to sign up. Link in the description. Now, back in the video. At March 20th, 1943. 0400 hours. The Gafsa El Guettar Road, Tunisia. The dark in North Africa in March has a texture to it. It isn't the soft dark of American nights. It presses against you. The men of B Company moved in a column that was too close together and too quiet, boots scraping stone, the clink of equipment muffled under tape and cloth. Nobody talking because there was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said. Rourke walked near the front. He always walked near the front. This was not bravery. It was information management. An officer at the front of a column knows what his men are walking into before they do. He has 1 extra second to make a decision. In the arithmetic of infantry warfare, 1 extra second is the difference between positions lost and positions held. At 0420, Sergeant Aguilera touched Rourke's arm. The road was wrong. The map showed a dry wadi, a seasonal stream bed, crossing the road approximately 800 meters ahead. The wadi should have been empty, passable. The 1st Infantry Division's engineers had assessed it as a non-obstacle. The smell told a different story. Diesel. Faint but unmistakable. The specific, metallic sweet smell of German military diesel, which burned differently from American fuel, a fact that veteran North Africa soldiers had learned to register the way hunters learn the smell of specific animals. Someone had been here. Recently. Something with an engine. Rourke stopped the column with a closed fist. He signaled Price forward. Price looked at the compass, then at the terrain ahead, then at the sky, still black, stars still sharp, and said quietly, "That incline's wrong. The map's got a slope there. It ain't there." The ground itself had been misrepresented. Either the map was wrong, or someone had altered what was on it, filled in the wadi with something that hadn't been there before. Then Private Osei, 20 meters back along the column, touched the radio. The SCR 300 that was supposed to connect them to battalion, and got nothing. Not static, not a bad connection. Silence. The kind of silence that meant something was blocking the frequency from close range. Rourke had 40 seconds to process this information. He used 30 of them. The ambush came from both sides simultaneously. Machine gun fire from the left slope. 2 MG-42s. Their cyclic rate so fast, the individual shots dissolved into a single tearing sound, 3,000 rounds per minute, making a noise no American soldier ever fully got used to, no matter how many times they heard it. From the right, mortar rounds, 4 in rapid succession, walking down the column from the rear forward, bracketing perfectly. Someone had ranged this position before dawn. This was not an improvised defense. Rourke hit the ground. He heard Aguilera's voice. "Cover left! Cover left! Move!" and heard men responding, which meant men were still alive enough to respond. He crawled to the ditch on the road's right edge and looked back. 2 men were down. Neither was moving. Private First Class Marcus Webb, 21, of Mobile, Alabama, lay 4 meters behind where Rourke had been standing. He didn't get up. Corporal Jesse Hartman, 26, of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, had caught a mortar fragment across the legs and was trying to drag himself toward the ditch, not making it. Rourke turned back to the road ahead. The wadi, 30-meter open ground, no cover, 2 machine gun positions firing across it. Beyond it, in the direction they needed to go, German soldiers were taking up positions he could hear, but not see. The radio crackled. Battalion. The voice on the other end was not the battalion commander. It was the S3, the operations officer, and what he said made Rourke's stomach drop. "Rourke, new orders from regiment. The flanking units on Jebel Orbata are engaged and falling back. You are to hold your current position and not advance until further notice. Repeat, do not advance. Maintain position and await instructions. Rourke looked at the two MG-42 positions still firing, and maintaining position meant dying by degrees. Every minute they sat still, the Germans had more time to maneuver. He keyed the radio. "We are taking fire from the high ground. We cannot hold this position without either advancing or withdrawing. Request clarification." Silence. The radio went dead again, and then Osei, lying flat beside Rourke, his hands steady on the set despite everything, said, "Sir, I'm counting. There's more of them than the briefing said. A lot more." He was right. The muzzle flashes alone, and Rourke was counting them, suggested not a company-level ambush, but a battalion. 300 men, minimum, against B Company's remaining 161. 3-1, on ground that had been prepared. With artillery they couldn't reach. Rourke looked at the playing card Aguilera had been holding in his hand when the shooting started. A jack of spades pulled out of a pocket in the first shock of contact, the way some men grabbed rosaries and others grabbed letters, and Aguilera grabbed whatever was in his hand, and then the sergeant dropped it in the dirt without noticing. A like on this video costs you 2 seconds. For the 161 men of B Company who were about to fight their way through what no one in the Allied chain of command believed was possible. It's the least we can do. In the German command post east of the Wadi, Major Krebs was already writing the message to von Broich. The Americans had walked into the prepared position exactly as expected. They were pinned. The Wadi was held. But something in his second paragraph gave Krebs pause, and he wrote, "The Americans have not broken. They have gone to ground and appear to be consolidating. This is unexpected." The thing about George S. Patton that most histories get wrong is this. He was not a commander who operated on inspiration. He was a commander who operated on doctrine, specifically his own doctrine, hammered into every officer under his command through what amounted to continuous education. Before Patton took command of 2nd Corps, he instituted what his staff called the evening seminars. Officers gathered, and Patton, standing without notes, would work through tactical problems, not hypotheticals, but historical battles, dissecting German failure at Verdun and German success at Sedan, Allied failure at Gallipoli, and Allied success at Amiens. The point he returned to over and over in language that his officers could recite. Fixed positions are decided before the battle begins, by the side that reads the ground best. The ground always has a back door. Your job is to find it before the enemy locks it. He had said this to Rourke personally, in Tebessa, 3 days before the advance. Rourke hadn't fully understood it then. Lying in the ditch outside El Guettar, with MG-42 fire crossing 8 meters over his head, he understood it completely. The German position was perfect, from the front. It had been designed to stop an advance along the road. 2 machine guns covering the open ground of the Wadi. Mortars registered on the approach. Infantry dug into the slopes. Any commander who looked at a map would see only one option: suppress and push through, take the casualties, reach the other side. Where Rourke looked at the ground, not the map. To the south of the road, behind the German left flank machine gun position, the terrain rose sharply for 60 meters, and then He could see it in the faint pre-dawn light, dropped away into a dry stream bed. Not on any map, not in any briefing. But there. He had seen it from the air photograph that had been passed around at Tabessa, which he had kept folded in his pocket, because no one had told him to give it back. The Germans had not positioned anyone in that dead ground. They hadn't needed to. Nobody coming from the front would think of going there. It required walking away from the objective. Patton's principle. The obstacle tells you where the enemy expects you to go. Go somewhere else. But here was the civilian problem, and it was real. 3 Tunisian families, approximately 14 people, had taken shelter in a stone farmhouse 200 meters into that dead ground, the same dead ground Rourke needed to move through. He had seen the smoke from the farmhouse chimney an hour before the ambush. He hadn't thought about it then. He thought about it now. Moving through that dead ground meant moving past those civilians. In the dark, in the confusion, with German soldiers potentially falling back toward exactly that location if the flanking worked, those 14 people were about to be in the middle of a firefight. Rourke had 3 minutes to decide. He chose. He sent Price forward with 4 men, not to fight through the dead ground, but first to reach the farmhouse, to warn the families, to push them south toward a second covered position he'd spotted in the photograph. Price had 20 minutes. If he couldn't move the civilians in 20 minutes, Rourke's plan collapsed. Price didn't waste time confirming the order. He moved. Rourke pulled Aguilera and the remaining element, 91 men, Hartmann bandaged and moving under his own power, his rifle still in his hands, into a holding position designed to look like a company preparing to assault the wadi frontally. Fire, move back, fire again. Enough noise and muzzle flash to keep German eyes facing west. In the German observation post above the wadi, Corporal Werner Dahl watched the Americans through his scope and relayed a report that would be preserved in captured Wehrmacht records. The enemy is attempting to organize a frontal assault across the wadi. Their fire discipline is poor. They appear disorganized. Dahl was watching exactly what Rourke wanted him to watch. In the farmhouse, Price found the families, 3 generations in one room, an oil lamp, a grandmother who had seen the last war, and understood immediately what Price needed without him being able to speak a word of Arabic. She was moving people toward the south door before he finished gesturing. 16 minutes. If the name Thomas Rourke and the men who followed him into that dead ground has stayed with you, the channel that brings you stories like this survives on subscriptions. It costs you nothing. For B Company, it cost everything. 0517 hours. Dead ground south of the Guettar road. 91 men moved in silence. That was not actually silence. It was the sustained roar of their own covering fire behind them, a noise that covered the sound of boots on stone. Rourke led. Price materialized from the darkness ahead. Civilians clear, sir, south position, and fell in beside him. The stone farmhouse slid past on their left, dark now, the chimney gone cold. 14 people were in a hollow in the earth 300 meters south, alive because someone had thought about them. The dead ground opened into the stream bed. 60 meters of it, running roughly north-south, cutting behind the German left flank machine gun position. From below, Rourke could hear it. The MG-42, firing in long bursts now, the gunner working the wadi, convinced the main threat was still coming from the west. He was wrong about where the threat was. Rourke split the company. Aguilera would take 40 men along the stream bed's northern edge toward the machine gun position. Rourke would take the remaining 50 south toward the mortar positions he'd marked from the sound triangulation during the first barrage. Price, with one squad, would hold the stream bed as a fallback. He had no radio to coordinate timing. He set his watch against Aguilera's and said, 7 minutes from now. That was all. Aguilera, Sergeant First Class, 31, El Paso, Texas, later wrote in an after-action account that would be quoted in the 1st Infantry Division's official history. The captain had the look he got when he'd made up his mind. Not angry, not scared, just done thinking. We were moving before I'd finished reading his face. 7 minutes felt like 7 years, and 7 seconds at the same time. At minute 3, Rourke's element came over the stream bed's southern lip and into the German mortar position from behind. The Germans there, 8 men, a crew for 2 81mm mortars, had been watching a compass, azimuth west, for 90 minutes. They heard the Americans coming from the east. For approximately 4 seconds, this made no sense to them. 4 seconds was enough. The mortar position was taken without firing a shot. Rourke didn't let the men stop. Keep moving. North. Now. At minute 6, everything went wrong simultaneously. A German squad, reserve element, positioned precisely where the intelligence had said there would be nobody, emerged from a depression in the ground 30 meters ahead of Rourke's men. 8 Germans. They saw the Americans at the same moment the Americans saw them. Contact. The firefight lasted 40 seconds and felt like a geological era. Private Leonard Osei, 19, Chicago, Illinois, B Company's radio operator, took a round through the left shoulder at the first burst. He didn't go down. He sat down, deliberately, controlled, the way a man sits down who doesn't trust his legs but trusts his hands, and kept the radio running, sending a continuous position report to battalion on a frequency he'd shifted to during the ambush, the only reason battalion had any idea where B Company was at all. Staff Sergeant Price reached Rourke's position at minute 7 when the reserve squad was neutralized, and said what he always said after a firefight, "How many?" Rourke looked around. Osei's hit. Michaels. Somebody find Michaels. Private Gerard Michaels, 22, of Albuquerque, New Mexico, was dead. He had been at the front of the element when the reserve squad opened up, and he had absorbed the first burst so that the men behind him didn't. 1 second of thought, then forward. At minute 7 and 30 seconds, they heard Aguilera, not the MG-42. That sound had stopped. What they heard was Aguilera's voice, at full volume, which meant the shooting was over in his sector. And then the sound of his men moving north, fast. The left flank of the German position had been folded back. In the German command post, Major Krebs's phone rang at 0531. The first report said the mortar position was gone. The second report, arriving 14 seconds later, said the left flank machine gun was lost. The third report, from the wadi itself, said the American element in the west, the one that had been firing sporadically, was now crossing the open ground. All 3 threats, simultaneously. Krebs would write in the captured war diary that American intelligence officers translated on April 14, 1943. By 05:35, it was clear we had misidentified the primary American axis of advance. The flanking movement was executed with a precision I would not have credited to this unit 24 hours earlier. We had prepared for one American attack. We received 3. The German position broke at 05:48 hours. Not fled, broke. A controlled German defensive position, manned by experienced soldiers who had fought in France and Russia, came apart in 11 minutes, because the flank they hadn't reinforced was the flank that mattered. Rourke's men moved through the position, clearing it room by room and foxhole by foxhole, the way they had trained in the chalk hills outside Tebessa, the way Patton's officers had insisted they train until it was mechanical, until it happened even when their hands were shaking and their lungs were burning. The road to El Guettar was open, but then the second crisis hit. Battalion finally reached on Osei's repaired radio. Osei directing the transmission with his one working arm, the other immobilized against his chest, issued the order that made Rourke close his eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Advance to the second phase line. Push through. Do not hold at the wadi. The second phase line was 1,400 meters east, across open ground, with 47 operational men, 3 wounded, ammunition at less than 40%, and no mortar support because both of the mortars they'd captured had no American-compatible rounds. Outnumbered on the ground ahead, undersupplied, and with no backup in range. This was Patton's test, and it had been designed by the Germans. Rourke read the terrain one more time. The farmhouse. He'd moved civilians out of it. It was stone, thick-walled, positioned on the slight rise that the German left flank guns had been covering. From that rise, it commanded the eastern approach. He didn't advance to the second phase line. He took the farmhouse. He put Aguilera's element on the roof with the 2 German MG-42s they'd captured. Ammunition for those was everywhere, and established a defensive position that covered 270 degrees. He sent Price and 2 men east on foot, fast, to locate and mark the German position for the artillery that battalion was supposedly bringing up. And then he called battalion back and said, with the specific calm that commanders develop when they've run out of alternatives, "I have the high ground. Bring the artillery. I will mark the target." It took 22 minutes for the artillery to arrive and another 9 minutes for the firing to begin. In those 31 minutes, 2 German counterattacks probed Rourke's position. The captured MG-42s, handled by men who had picked up their operation in the previous hour by observation, turned both of them back. At 08:31 hours on March 20th, 1943, with American artillery reshaping the ground to his east, Captain Thomas J. Rourke, B Company, 18th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, walked out of the farmhouse and sat down in the dust of the Tunisian road. He took out the photograph of Catherine and Patrick. He looked at it for a long time. He put it back. The objective was taken. 11 of his men were dead. 23 were wounded. One, Leonard Osei, and was sitting against the farmhouse wall with his radio still running, directing artillery adjustments one-handed, and had not stopped doing so since the first moment of contact. The road to El Guettar was open. The battlefield after it's over is not what the movies show. It isn't glorious. It isn't quiet in any peaceful sense. It smells of propellant and something sharper that the men who've been in it describe around, not through. The ground is disturbed everywhere. Foxholes you didn't dig. Equipment you don't recognize. The specific disarray of positions that were held and then left in a hurry. The German wadi position, when Rourke's men walked through it at 0900 hours, contained 73 dead German soldiers, 14 prisoners, 2 operational 81mm mortars, 4 cases of ammunition, and 1 desk, an actual field desk, set up in the command post with a chair, a lamp, and a half-completed letter in German that none of Rourke's men could read, but that an intelligence officer later translated as a letter to a wife in Munich, describing the American advance as not yet a serious concern. The letter was dated March 19th, the day before. General Lieutenant von Broich, captured on May 12, 1943, along with the bulk of Army Group Africa, the largest Axis surrender in the Mediterranean theater, 275,000 men, was debriefed extensively by American and British intelligence officers. His testimony on the El Guettar action was preserved and has been quoted in multiple operational histories of the North Africa campaign. He said, and in the British debrief transcript, the flanking movement was unexpected because it required the abandonment of the direct approach at the moment of maximum pressure. This is not what American formations had done at Kasserine. We anticipated Kasserine. What we received was something else. He was asked what had changed. He paused. Then, the commander, the approach. It was Patton's approach. I had read his file. I had underestimated what the file meant in practice. Read that again. The general who had given them 72 hours was acknowledging, in a British prisoner of war debrief, that he had studied Patton and still not understood him. Patton received the action report on March 21st, 1943. He wrote in his diary an entry that is now in the Library of Congress collection. Rourke at the Wadi. Read it 3 times. That is the thing I have been trying to teach since 1940. The obstacle is information. The enemy's confidence is a map. B Company read the map. He recommended Rourke for the Silver Star. It was approved on April 7th, 1943. What is the lesson that this battle leaves behind? Not as doctrine, not as strategy, but as a truth about how human beings, under extremity, actually function. Patton's philosophy was not about aggression. Every history that reduces him to a slapping, swearing, pistol-waving aggressor misses the intellectual core of what he built. The core was this: information travels in both directions. Your enemy's confidence tells you where he believes he is strong. Where he believes he is strong, he has not reinforced. Where he has not reinforced is where you go, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how far it takes you from the road that everyone can see. The obstacle is not the problem. The obstacle is the answer. Von Arnim's prediction, 72 hours, American forces will fail, was not stupidity. It was logic applied to incomplete data. He had seen Kasserine. He had seen American formations break under pressure they didn't expect. What he had not seen was Patton's training taking hold in the minds of 163 men who were frightened, cold, out of radio contact, undersupplied, outnumbered, and moving anyway. The Jack of Spades in the mud outside El Guettar was eventually picked up by a military photographer whose name doesn't appear in any record. It was included in a batch of photographs that passed through Signal Corps processing in Oran and then disappeared into an archive. Whether it exists today in some box in the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, is unknown. What is known: Private First Class Leonard Osei, 19, Chicago, Illinois, was awarded the Bronze Star with Valor Device for his actions on March 20, 1943. He served through the rest of the North Africa campaign, through Sicily, through France. He came home to Chicago in December 1945. He worked as an electrician. He died in 1991 at the age of 67. His daughter, speaking at his funeral, said he had kept a radio, a broken one, unrepairable, on a shelf in the garage for his entire adult life, and would never say why. She knew why. Everybody who had ever been in contact with radio silence at the worst possible moment knew why. You keep what kept you alive, even when it's broken, even when you can't explain it to anyone who wasn't there. If your father, grandfather, or great-grandfather served in the North Africa campaign, the Tunisia campaign, or with any unit of the 1st Infantry Division, the big red one, I want to hear about it in the comments. What unit? Which campaign? Where did they end up? Those stories live in family memory and almost nowhere else. Don't let them go. Von Arnhem's 72 hours expired on the morning of March 20th, 1943, at 08:31 hours, when B Company's last transmission to battalion confirmed the position secure. The German general had been right about one thing. The Americans hadn't held beyond 72 hours. They'd broken through in 12.